He was 69 when he finally allowed himself to whisper the sentence he had carried like a shadow for decades. In the dim glow of a late autumn evening, with the last threads of daylight fading behind the Welsh hills, Michael Sheen sat alone in a silent room and murmured, almost too quietly for anyone to hear, "There are 5 people I will never forgive." The words hung in the air like dust floating through a dying beam of gold, fragile yet unbreakable, as if time itself paused to listen. There was no audience, no cameras, no applause, only the faint ticking of a distant clock and the weight of a life spent in the constant pull between brilliance and heartbreak. Sheen had lived under the harsh white lights of stages and film sets, had worn the faces of kings, revolutionaries, and broken men, had carried entire worlds within his performances. Yet nothing felt as heavy as the memory of those who had carved wounds across his soul long before the world ever knew his name. He stared at the small wooden table in front of him, its surface scratched by years of use, a quiet testament to the private battles fought behind closed doors. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows with a slow, persistent rhythm, as if echoing a truth he had tried to bury. For a moment, his breath tightened, and his eyes drifted toward a single photograph at the edge of the room. A reminder of a time when trust still felt possible. Most people remember Michael Sheen for his voice, his fire, his precision. But tonight the world outside dissolved into silence as he prepared to enter the territory he had avoided for a lifetime. Who were the 5 faces he could never erase? Before the world learned his name, before applause wrapped around him like a second skin, Michael Sheen was simply a quiet boy growing up in the subdued grays of Port Talbot, where the sky often seemed heavy enough to touch. His childhood unfolded in narrow streets lined with coal dust and modest homes, places where people carried their dreams close to the chest because life rarely allowed them to bloom. He learned early that silence could be both a refuge and a shield, a lesson that would follow him far longer than he ever expected. His father, a man of restless hands and sudden laughter, worked tirelessly to keep the family afloat. His mother, gentle and observant, kept the home filled with warmth, even on the days when money, time, and comfort were all stretched thin. Yet beneath the softness of that household, young Michael sensed the brittleness of unspoken fears. He watched his parents navigate the quiet pressures of adulthood, and somewhere in those early years he discovered the weight of expectations, how they could press on a child's shoulders before he even understood their shape. There was a moment, one he rarely speaks of, that marked the first crack in his sense of safety. A teacher, frustrated, dismissive, once looked at him with cold certainty and said he would never make anything meaningful of his life. The words struck deeper than intended, carving a wound that settled into his memory like frost beneath the skin. He carried that sentence with him for years, long after he proved it wrong, long after stages and film sets replaced the small classroom where doubt first found him. Still, there were bright sparks. He found solace in stories, in the whispered drama of radio plays, in the flicker of old films, in the way voices could transform into entire worlds. Acting was not yet a dream. It was an escape route, a quiet door through which he could step and become someone untouched by fear or limitation. But even in those early days, he sensed that every new dream demanded a sacrifice. These beginnings, fragile, tender, bruised, shaped the man he would become, a man who learned to rise, a man who learned to fight, and a man who, even decades later, still carried the echoes of those first wounds in the chambers of his heart. As Michael stepped out of adolescence and into the uncertain terrain of young adulthood, the world around him seemed to widen, as though the sky itself had been pulled open. He left Port Talbot with a mix of trepidation and determination, carrying little more than a battered suitcase, a handful of hand-me-down dreams, and a fire he couldn't quite extinguish. London was overwhelming at first, loud, indifferent, endlessly moving, but somewhere within that chaos, he sensed the faint outline of a destiny calling to him. At the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, he found a world unlike anything he had known. For the first time, his silence was not seen as weakness, but as depth. His intensity, once misunderstood, became an instrument. He learned how to sculpt emotion, how to harness breath, how to inhabit the fragile spaces between words. Teachers who once doubted boys like him were replaced by mentors who saw something raw and unpolished in him, a spark that could ignite on stage. Yet even with their encouragement, he felt the lingering ghost of his childhood doubt, whispering that every triumph could vanish as quickly as it appeared. The years that followed moved with a relentless rhythm. Early stage roles turned into breakthrough performances. He became known for his precision, his ability to transform, his unflinching vulnerability. Critics praised him. Audiences adored him. Directors sought him. The lights grew brighter, the expectations heavier, and with each new success came a deeper sense of solitude, an unexpected ache beneath the applause. He entered the world of film almost reluctantly, unsure whether the camera would accept or reject him. Yet it embraced him with surprising ease. Roles in historical dramas, political thrillers, and intimate character studies cemented his reputation. He portrayed men torn by conflict, burdened by truth, seduced by power. It was as if every wound he had ever carried, every hesitation, every buried fear, found its way into his performances. And people felt it. They believed him not because he acted convincingly, but because he lived inside each role with an intensity that bordered on devotion. But even as fame wrapped itself around him, small fractures began to form, hairline cracks invisible to the public eye. The demands of success grew louder. The industry, once a sanctuary, became unpredictable, filled with shifting loyalties and quiet betrayals. Friends faded, promises dissolved. The higher he climbed, the more precarious the ground beneath him felt. One evening, after a particularly draining rehearsal, he stood alone on the stage of a dim theater. The seats were empty, the air cold. He could hear the distant hum of a city that did not care whether he soared or fell. In that stillness, he realized that greatness came with a silent cost. The erosion of trust, the blurring of boundaries, the slow unraveling of innocence. He kept rising. The world kept watching. But behind every spotlight, behind every echoed cheer, he sensed something shifting, something fragile, something preparing to break. Success, for all its glitter, carries a quiet shadow, and Michael first noticed it during a season when everything seemed to be going right. He was performing nightly to sold-out theaters, receiving scripts from directors he once admired from afar, and giving interviews in which he tried, sometimes unsuccessfully, to appear untouched by the rising tide of expectation. Yet beneath the surface of that golden period, something was beginning to splinter. The turning point came not with a dramatic explosion, but with a slow, almost invisible unraveling. A collaborator he trusted deeply, someone he believed saw him not just as an actor, but as a human being, made a choice that cut him without warning. A project they had built together, word by word, breath by breath, was handed to another performer behind closed doors. No explanation, no phone call, not even a moment of honesty. It was a betrayal delivered with the softness of a whisper, yet it echoed through him like a collapsing stage. After that, every room felt colder. Conversations thinned. Smiles became masks. The world he had once thought of as a community now seemed like a maze of shifting alliances, where loyalty lasted only as long as it was convenient. He tried to push through, to drown the hurt in work, but each rehearsal, each performance carried a new kind of weight, a quiet reminder that trust could evaporate in an instant. Then came the rupture that marked him more deeply than he expected. A relationship he had invested years into dissolved under the pressure of distance, careers, and unspoken resentments. The breakup wasn't explosive. It was a slow fade, a gradual dimming of two lights that once burned brightly together. When it ended, he found himself alone in an apartment filled with remnants of a life shared. Photographs, books, unfinished letters. He realized then how fragile connection could be, how quickly love could turn into silence. These fractures, subtle yet devastating, reshaped him. He learned to guard himself carefully, to speak less, to reveal even less. The world saw him thriving, but inside, trust had begun to calcify into something harder, something colder. And as the years passed, the list of those he could not forgive began to take shape. 5 names etched not in anger, but in the deep, unhealed places of his soul. 5 names, 5 wounds, 5 shadows that followed Michael Sheen through every ascent, every triumph, every quiet moment when applause faded and the room fell still. He never wrote them down, never spoke them aloud to anyone, yet they lived inside him with the persistence of scars, visible only in the way his voice deepened when he spoke of trust, or the way his gaze lingered a second too long on moments of betrayal. The first person he could never forgive was someone from the beginning of his journey, back when ambition was still fragile and hope was still unarmored. She had been a close friend, a confidant, someone who understood his loneliness before the world ever cared about his brilliance. But when an opportunity arose that could lift one of them into the spotlight, she reshaped the truth behind closed doors, twisting his intentions, casting doubts on his integrity, and positioning herself as the necessary choice. The betrayal was not in her ambition. He respected that, but in the quiet way she erased him, as if their years of trust were a simple currency to be spent. The wound she left was subtle, soft on the surface, yet it reshaped the way he measured sincerity forever. The second person came later, when his career was gathering momentum. A director known for intensity and innovation brought Michael into a project he believed would redefine him. They worked closely, long nights, difficult scenes, endless rehearsals. Michael gave everything, trusting the promises made to him. But when the film premiered, key choices were altered, scenes were re-edited, and his performance, his most vulnerable work, was cut into fragments. The director claimed artistic necessity, but Michael knew it was ego, competition, and fear of being overshadowed. The shock was sharp, unexpected, a jolt that left him questioning not his art, but the honesty of those who held power over it. The third name was deeply personal, someone tied to the roots of his life rather than the branches of his career. A family member he had once admired, someone who should have offered safety, instead left him with a wound that shaped the way he viewed loyalty. Words spoken in anger, accusations that twisted the truth of who he was, and years of silence carved a distance that could not be crossed again. This hurt was not theatrical. It was quiet, domestic, the kind that lingers in the spaces between holidays and memories. He learned that even blood could fracture, and sometimes the deepest scars were born in the places meant to protect us. The fourth person was not a single individual, but a public force, an amorphous, relentless pressure from the industry and media that once elevated him. During one turbulent chapter of his career, the press constructed narratives that distorted his actions, motives, and private life. Commentators who had never met him dissected him publicly, stripping nuance from his choices, turning vulnerability into spectacle. He tried to hold his composure, to maintain grace, but inside something broke. Not because strangers judged him, but because they did so without ever seeking the truth. He couldn't forgive the machinery that devoured complexity and replaced it with caricature. And then, after all the years, after all the fractures, after the names he carried like stones in his chest, came the fifth. The one that frightened him the most. The one he avoided naming, avoided confronting, avoided admitting even to himself. The fifth person he could never forgive was Michael Sheen. Not for his failures, which were human, nor for the choices that came with survival. It was something deeper. He blamed himself for trusting too easily when he was young, for closing himself off too tightly when he grew older, for allowing fear to guide him more than hope. He carried guilt for the relationships he couldn't salvage, the apologies he never delivered, the moments of anger he allowed to harden into silence. In quiet hours, he replayed scenes from his own life with the precision of an actor analyzing a performance, seeing clearly every hesitation, every misstep. And the cruelty he directed toward himself was sharper than anything the outside world had ever given him. He realized with time that the greatest wound was not inflicted upon him, but by him. That was the truth he whispered on that quiet autumn evening. That was the final scar that never fully closed. 5 names, 4 from the world, 1 from the mirror, and each one shaped the man he had become. Night had fully settled by the time Michael rose from his chair, the room now soaked in a muted amber glow. The photograph on the far table, once only a distant presence, seemed to watch him with a quiet patience, as though it had been waiting for this moment of reckoning. He walked toward it slowly, each step echoing with years of unspoken truths, and paused before the image. A younger version of himself, smiling without hesitation, untouched by betrayal. For a long moment he stood there, neither mourning nor longing, simply acknowledging the distance between who he was and who he had become. He touched the frame lightly, as if afraid the past would crumble beneath his fingers. The weight he had carried for so many years felt both heavier and lighter all at once. Heavier because he had finally named the scars. Lighter because naming them allowed him to breathe again. Outside, the wind had softened, brushing against the windows with a gentleness that felt almost like forgiveness. But forgiveness, he knew, was never simple. It was not a single moment, not a clean ending, but a slow unraveling of the knots he had kept tight for far too long. He sat once more, letting the silence settle around him like a warm, worn coat. The questions lingered in the room, unspoken yet present. Was he ready to forgive himself, even if the others could never be forgiven? And if he did, would the scars finally lose their power, or would they remain as quiet reminders of the life he had lived? The night did not answer. It simply held him, gently as he closed his eyes and allowed the uncertainty to remain. Could anyone truly move forward without forgiving the past? Or must some wounds stay open so we never forget what shaped us?